Okay. All right, everybody, welcome to the 245 session. This session is for the next 7 generations, tribal perspectives on environmental justice. My name is Matt Tomlinson, and I'm with Eagle Environment, Great Lakes and Energy. And before we get started here, just going to go over some housekeeping slides to help you with your experience in navigating this session. So I want to let you know that all lines are muted during these webinar sessions, and we are recording these webinar sessions. So if you've had a chance to go back into the Whova desktop and look at the sessions that were conducted yesterday, those have been uploaded. Additionally, you can go to Eagle's events website. So that's www.michigan.gov/Eagle events. And that's the location where you signed up for this event. And the videos are also attached there for yesterday. Let's see. So there's a couple of different ways you can ask questions with us. The first is through Zoom. You can use the Q&A dialog box, and you'll see that option at the lower portion of your screen on your Zoom toolbar. And you can also use the Whova application, Whova desktop app, and you can submit questions that way. And if you go into the Whova sessions, you actually have the option to rate sessions as well. So we encourage you to do that. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen here and turn it over to our first presenter, who is John Petoskey.
Hi, and Kyle and Whitney, if you want to turn your cameras on, please, by all means. So Ani, Neso Edamok, Indigenous, Mashika and Dodem, Getchawik Wedong and Donjaba, Anishinaabe, Odawa and Dao. My name is John Petoskey. The name that the creator gave me is The Sound of Birds. I am a member of the Grand Traverse Band of Ottawa and Chippewa Indians and Governor Whitmer's Michigan Advisory Council on Environmental Justice. And today I'm joined with by 2 distinguished guests, Professor Kyle Whyte of the University of Michigan and President Whitney Gravelle of the Bay Mills Indian Community. And the title of our panel today is For the Next 7 Generations, Tribal Perspectives on Environmental Justice. And the reason that I chose this panel is because in Anishinaabe teachings, we have a concept of living your life today with the 7 generations in the future in mind. And this can be applied to a whole host of environmental problems, thinking about climate change, water quality, or some of the other pressing environmental matters that have been discussed at this conference. So I encourage all the participants to live with those 7 generations in mind, and we're going to be talking today about how environmental justice incorporates this concept for tribal communities. And before we get started, I want to acknowledge that not only is this land the land of the Anishinaabe, the 3 Fires people, the Odawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi, but in our teachings, Michigan, and particularly the Straits of Mackinac, is where our world emerged. It's where the origin of our world is. There's an old story, our creation story, of the turtle emerging from the water, and out from it grew North America, our homeland. And for us, it is that location. It has an extreme and very beautiful spiritual importance, and continues to play an important role in our lives today. And so when we think about acknowledging the land, I think often we're thinking about the tribes that live there, or as some people would put it, used to live there. But for Native people, an acknowledgement of the land, a prayer for the land, is much more than that. It's tapping into our ancestors that protected it for us 7 generations ago. So I want to acknowledge the efforts of those ancestors in preserving our homelands for us today, and providing us with the opportunity to talk about some of these concepts with you. So I'm going to turn it over to our panelists to provide an introduction for themselves. So thank you for joining us.
Ani Bojo, Giweden Nagabo Kwe Indigenous, Guners Nakani Ndonjaba. Hi everyone, my name is Whitney Gravelle and I am the president and former tribal attorney of Bay Mills Indian Community. And I look forward to our discussion with all of you today, including talking about how environmental justice directly impacts tribal nations, not only across the country, but also here in the state of Michigan.
Vice President Gravelle, Bojo Bebam Kamigara Indigenous, Bodwadmi and Dow, Shishibanek, Bindagwes, Ann Arbor, Michigan, Doshibaya. Hey, everybody. I look forward to discussing more about EJSUs affecting Indigenous people.
Okay, so I think just to get started, I want to start with a really basic question. Like, why should society care about environmental justice for tribes?
Society needs to care. On the one hand, environmental injustices that affect Native people are not just economic impacts. They're not just discrete health impacts. They're impacts to the existence of entire communities and to the safety, the wellness of future generations. They're existential in nature. On the other hand, tribes are sovereigns and operate their own governments. And because of that, they can offer a very different vision of what environmental justice means and practice it as sovereigns.
Thank you. Yeah. So could you maybe talk about what that means to practice environmental justice as a sovereign?
Absolutely. One of the challenges that a lot of communities face, not just Native people, is they're concerned about the accountability of the US government, of state governments. They're worried that private industry is taking advantage of legal loopholes and is otherwise exploiting gray areas in the law. And because tribal governments can set their own code, they can set their own laws, they can exercise governance and co-management, as well as take authority over relationships that private industry might seek to have on tribal lands. Tribal governments can demonstrate what accountability means. They can demonstrate what it means to have a process that involves the community. They can demonstrate what it means to make sure that companies, that businesses, that governments actually take into consideration what tribes say is safe enough, what tribes say is harmful and violent against their communities.
Yeah, so President Gravelle, I want to talk a little bit about this environmental justice in practice. So Professor Whyte talked about practicing environmental justice as a sovereign. And so how do you think environmental justice for tribes and tribal communities is different than what other communities might experience as environmental injustice?
Yeah, John, I think, Kyle Whyte touched on it very briefly, but we can't look at environmental justice for tribal nations without taking into consideration tribal sovereignty. Everything is directly tied to it, including the recognition of tribal nations' unique historical, political, and legal circumstances that they share within the United States government. Their status as sovereign nations actually predates the United States, and with that comes an extremely long history of land management of tribally important natural resources, land, and waterways. And there's also the unique distinction that I like to share with folks is that our lifeways as Native people, as Native Americans, are actually extremely dependent on the interconnectedness of our relationship with the natural environment, whether it be the exercise of treaty rights, ceremony, cultural practices, or even religious beliefs. That is all rooted in our relationship with the earth and interwoven into the web of life, or the circle of life that they talk about in Lion King. It's all part of it. It's all part of our journey here on as we live out our lives. So for example, to explain this in a much more deeper way, we all introduced ourselves in Anishinaabe to start off this panel. And if you look at our traditional language, Anishinaabe, there are words for plants and animals that are animate, which identifies them as a living thing that has a spirit. So it's not just water, it's not just the tree, it's not just land or dirt, it's actually a living thing that we need to respect. And when something is regarded as a living thing, it should be given the same status as humans as we walk on the planet Earth. And again, this all ties back to our unique status as tribal sovereigns, because the central task of any sovereign depends not only on protecting those resources for their people, but it's also about preserving the health and well-being of your citizens, whether you be a tribal citizen or a citizen of the state of Michigan or a citizen of the United States. And again, that is all directly tied to our natural environment because we coexist with it. There's also something that I think articulates a really big difference between how tribal nations regulate versus how other governments regulate. As Vine Deloria Jr., he's a well-established scholar on environmental justice for tribal nations. He once observed that the United States is more of a rights society. So what do you have the right to do? What do you have the right to have? What do you have the right to exercise? But tribal nations are more of a responsibility society, as in what do we have the responsibility to do? What do we have the responsibility to protect? What do we have the responsibility to provide? And when we look at all of those teachings and how it's interwoven with the land, we can really see, that amongst our people, we rely on that natural environment. And we actually have some teachings. I know, Johnny, you mentioned the creation story. But another teaching, to give everyone a specific example, directly relates to whitefish. And whitefish in particular shows us that there used to be a whitefish clan. So we have traditional clans, whether they be bear, turtle, crane, etc., and how we identified a group of people or a family that resided within our traditional tribal nations. And during a time of famine, we have a teaching that the whitefish clan actually walked into the water and sacrificed themselves as humans to become the whitefish that we eat today. So there is no longer a whitefish clan established within our traditional Anishinaabe society. And when that happened, our Anishinaabe people made a promise, to that whitefish clan. They made a promise to the whitefish that swam in that water. And we made a promise that we would take care of the whitefish and its home in return for providing for our people. So because they provided for us in order to put food on the table, to sustain our economies, to provide for our families, we in turn would provide for the whitefish. We would ensure that, they had a sustainable and suitable environment to continue to thrive as an animal. So again, when you correlate all of that with tribal sovereignty and you look at, us being more of a responsibility society, you see in this teaching that it shows we not only have the right to that fish, but also a responsibility. And it all flows from that same covenant that we are equal here on earth and we must respect, our interconnectedness with that land and water. So I think, in sharing that some of the ways tribal environmental justice is very unique in these conversations related to environmental justice, it all has to do with our traditional lifeways and how we're interwoven and interconnected to the land.
Thank you so much, Whitney. That was excellent. And it reminds me, and I'm sure you too, like growing up in a tribal community, you're often surrounded by, stories of people who preserved our right to exist. And so it's not only that, we continue to live on our land. I think sometimes the treaties, when you think about treaty history in Michigan, there's a tendency to reduce it all to the right to kill animals, the right to take fish, the right to hunt. And while those are super important, I think what you're discussing, brings light to this idea of preserving your relationships with the land and living your life and thinking about even those treaty negotiators back in the day, thinking about us in the future. How are my people going to continue to live in a way that is consistent with our teachings, in a way that is preserving the earth and taking care of, not only our relatives, but our relatives in the water, our relatives in the sky, etc. And so it's a beautiful way to think about environmental justice. And I think, so thank you, Miigwech, for that. So, moving on to some more practical considerations. I think a lot of people who are in attendance in this conference or who are interested in environmental justice writ large, come from government, they come from the private sector. And, I think that there are myriad examples of when the government and private sector fail to consider some of these ideas that we're talking about, fail to consider religious practices with the environment, our historical connection to it. And so I wonder if Professor Whyte, you could discuss ways in which these entities have either failed or succeeded to incorporate environmental justice into their decision-making and into their processes, and what we can learn from that.
I appreciate President Gravelle's articulations just now and really setting the stage for a lot of important concepts and information and practices and ways of thinking about environmental justice that I do hope our audience here takes strongly to heart. For me, in my experience, a lot of times, governments and private industry, they treat tribes, they treat our peoples as stakeholders, as sort of part of a set of boxes to check when they're going through a permitting process. And they sort of see our consultation or our perspectives as sort of just things that aren't really that weighty in terms of the big decisions that are made about whether to create or repair a technology in certain lands or other aspects that go into environmental justice and environmental deliberations. And they really don't credit the fact that we have our own knowledge systems. Both of you made important points about our relationships with the non-human world, right? Those are relationships that were part of indigenous sciences that created incredible knowledge that made it possible for our peoples to survive and thrive for generations. And while some of the techniques and methods may differ from how, say, science is practiced in the University of Michigan, they are our sciences. They're the ones that we trust. They're the ones that we find credible. And they're the ones that also are in line with our aspirations to the future, for the future. And so our knowledge about what it means for something to be too high of a level of pollution or to be unsafe is often something that folks in government and companies, they seek to categorize within their own knowledge systems. And so it's extraordinarily important that indigenous knowledge, indigenous science is a leading science within policy, within permitting, within deliberation, and has that veto power, that credibility because of its importance to our own community protection. Another issue that I see a lot is that, and it goes along with the checkbox idea, one of the first experiences I had in a policy context for a particular agency, they hired a new liaison, and the liaison came in and said, well, I was about to retire, but my director said, can you just come back in for a few more months and fill this liaison position? And that was really insulting. They thought it was a joke to sort of break the ice of the mostly tribal leadership and policy audience there, but it was insulting, and it suggests the fact that the U.S. needs to invest in permanent diplomatic relationships with tribes. And it goes back to what President Gravelle said. It's one thing to have a right to be consulted, but it's another thing for the US, for states, for companies to actually discharge that responsibility as a responsibility, meaning that the funding is there, the support's there, and that for people that play those roles that interface with tribes, that it's a career opportunity for them, right? It's a long-term career opportunity for them. Now, where I've seen success is actually with a lot of nonprofit and organizations that have worked with tribes on conservation. If you look at some of the conservation initiatives that tribes have led, here in Michigan, one example is sturgeon restoration. If you look at the different partners, right, there are nonprofit organizations that have been part of those efforts. And throughout the United States, you'll see that tribes have partnered with nonprofits, and those organizations have oftentimes been part of a space that tribes created, where it was tribes culture, tribes knowledge that mattered, that shaped the project, and where what it meant to be involved early on was at the design phase. Consultation is not after the fact, it's at the design phase. And so if you find yourself in a situation where you've already done something, or you're pretty close to being about to do it. You're like, shoot, I need to check with some folks for permission. That's too late. And so I think you'll see in cases of success that there was that early involvement at the point of conception.
Thank you so much for that answer. Do you have any follow-ups, President Gravelle?
Yeah, I just want to build on, something that Kyle had identified as well is, oftentimes the natural resources that tribal nations rely upon for their very existence in many cases are not managed by the tribes themselves, but by other governmental entities, whether that be the state of Michigan or the United States. So while tribal nations can regulate their own land, or in some cases, like here in the state of Michigan, we're co-managers of tribally important treaty resources off reservation, like fish in the Great Lakes, from consent decree agreements from some litigation, United States versus Michigan. However, there are a lot of lands and waters, habitats and ecosystems that tribal nations rely upon, yet it is entirely outside of our jurisdiction. And in fact, as Professor Whyte had identified, many of the environmental justice issues that we see and we'll discuss later in this panel can often be characterized as coming from a non-tribal management of those resources. Tribal nations are often painted as, the first stewards of this land, and that is not an easy or readily given categorization. Our people have lived on this land for centuries, since time immemorial, and our lifeways are part of the land in and of itself. We have an inherent knowledge of how to interact with that land and how to maintain it that needs to be respected. And when you look at tribal consultation, as Professor Whyte said, there is federal tribal consultation that is rooted in the trust responsibility that the United States holds for tribes. So they engaged in treaties. There were solemn promises that were made and need to be upheld even in present day times. But here in the state of Michigan, there's also a government-to-government accord that has been, authorized by numerous governors between the state of Michigan and tribal nations regarding consultation. And that requires timely notification of the proposed action, informing other governments of the potential impact of that action and the interests of that tribal government, as well as the opportunity to provide input and recommendations on those actions that will be taken, and the right to be advised of the rejections and the basis of any such rejections from tribal nations on recommendations for those actions. And one important element that I think is often missing in tribal consultation, which is actually to be held as the gold standard of consultation, is a principle we see in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which has been endorsed by the United States, but that includes free, prior, and informed consent regarding the approval of any project that may impact tribal nation resources, territories, land, or is in connection with any type of development or exploitation of mineral water or other resources that may be assigned to that specific tribal nation. So again, the theme of today really ties that all to sovereignty and self-determination of these tribal nations. If we look at the principle of free, prior, and informed consent, it is grounded in that right of tribal sovereignty and self-determination. It is empowering those tribal nations to make and be a part of decisions that are impacting their land, their water, and their resources. We all know tribes are separate sovereigns with pre-existing constitutions, and they have that inherent right to self-determination. But until that is acknowledged and respected either by, state entities or private entities, we're not going to see any type of meaningful environmental justice for tribal nations and the projects that are being performed on their land, within their waters, or impacting their resources.
Thank you. Yeah, so you bring up, just what we're about to turn to, and that is, present environmental justice concerns for tribes in Michigan. And I think both of you bring an enormous wealth of experience to this panel, and particularly around issues of federal and state policy. Both of you work, Professor Whyte on the Environmental Justice Advisory Council at the White House, and President Gravelle obviously is dealing with, interface with agencies at the federal and state level. And so I wonder if you could both maybe identify some of the major environmental justice issues facing Michigan tribes today.
Yeah, John, I'll go first because I think the big environmental justice issue for tribal nations here in the state of Michigan is actually the Line 5 dual pipelines. We've seen a lot of that in the news and media. There's been a lot of litigation surrounding that issue, as well as a really vocal participation by tribal nations. And I wanted to provide, I think, a little bit of background context on why tribes are getting involved. We talk about our relationship with the land, but directly correlation to that is our treaty rights, which is something that we haven't gone into specifics about. So Bay Mills Indian Community is actually a signatory to the 1836 Treaty of Washington, which ceded 14 million acres of land and 13 million acres of water to the United States for the creation of the state of Michigan. And if we all pull up like our Michigan hand maps, that's essentially the northern half of the Lower Peninsula and the eastern half of the Upper Peninsula. So it's essentially, your northern Michigan that was ceded. And in that treaty, Bay Mills, as well as the other signatory tribes, of which, Johnny is part of as well, reserve the right to fish, hunt, and gather throughout that ceded territory, which includes the Great Lakes and the Straits of Mackinac. And this is where, when we start looking at environmental justice, it can get really complicated, because under the United States Constitution, treaties are the supreme law of the land. And part of that treaty obligation shows that not only the state of Michigan, but well as state agencies and private entities, when they're acting on behalf of a state governmental body, are legally obligated to honor that treaty and preserve the treaty resources that those tribal nations are relying upon. Because as we mentioned earlier in the panel, that is how we live out our traditional lifeways as a people. If we don't have access to the waters and lands where we can exercise that treaty right, we can't perform ceremony, we can't engage in the commercial right to fish. And that duty goes so much further than just protecting the fish itself. You have to also protect the resources upon which that fish may rely. So you're looking at habitat protection or ecosystem protection for those fish populations upon which the treaty rights depend. You can't have a treaty right to fish if there's no fish in the water, and you can't have a treaty right to fish if there's no clean water for those fish to survive. So when we're really looking at Line 5 issues, it is very correlated to environmental justice, because you have tribal nations who are calling upon the legal responsibilities of these federal and state officials to acknowledge, preserve, and uphold those treaty rights. When we look at the Indigenous people here in the Great Lakes, the Straits of Mackinac occupies a very hallowed place in our history, not only for Natives, but also non-Natives in the state of Michigan. It is considered the center of thousands of years of trade, travel, and history for Anishinaabe and non-Anishinaabe. And it is also seen as somewhat of like a sacred wellspring of Anishinaabe life and culture. So when you look at the Line 5 dual pipelines, and you have a pipeline that runs directly through treaty ceded territory, it runs directly through ecosystems and habitats upon which tribal nations rely, as we've identified. And then it also runs through a significantly cultural place for Indigenous people that they still hold value in their relationship to. When you combine all of that together and you have 12 tribal nations in the state of Michigan asking for the decommissioning of the Line 5 dual pipelines, that is environmental justice in and of itself. You have tribal nations, you have people of color, you have women of color who are asking to be included in that conversation and have their interests taken into account when making decisions related to the Line 5 dual pipelines or the Line 5 Great Lakes Tunnel project. And what you see is that is then encumbered by the state and federal regulatory process that these private entities go through. Oftentimes when we engage in those conversations, when you look at the treaty right And again, as was identified for tribal consultation, it's almost seemed, yeah, well, the treaty right exists, you're right, but what does that have to do with this conversation? It has everything to do with that conversation. That's why tribal nations get involved. I've realized in my practice that oftentimes people look at treaties as something of the thing of a past, you know, that it's a historical document. Tribal nations view it entirely the opposite. It's a living document. And when our ancestors went to go negotiate those treaties, they would touch an eagle feather because they knew before they signed that treaty that they were making a sacred promise to themselves. They knew that in exchange for that land and water, they could preserve the lifeways of a people and preserve the existence of their children and their children's children for the next 7 generations, which is what this panel is all about. So when you start to bring everything together, you know, line 5 is an environmental justice issue. Are we going to take Indigenous people's voices into consideration before we run a pipeline through their land and through their water that will impact their very existence?
Thank you so much, Whitney. And yeah, often too, like when thinking about this issue, I always try to frame it in terms of, you know, the government in the United States government owes certain things to its citizens and its constitution. And for tribal people, that's the federal trust responsibility. It is obligations under treaties. And those are just as much civil rights as, you know, protection under the 14th Amendment. And so, you know, the way that we talk about these things matters. And I think you put it so well that treaties are so much more than just the fish in the water. They're about relationships, they're about our culture, and they're about our history as a country writ large. So Professor Whyte, I wonder if you had any follow-ups to what Whitney said, and if you could just give us some insight into, you know, where you think these issues will go in the future, be it from the federal policy perspective, the state policy perspective, and you know, where we hope that they go.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, Michigan continues to be a place where many tribes are struggling with EJ issues that reflect historic EJ issues. You know, it's important to note that Michigan is well known for being deforested. It's well known for its early entry into the mining industry. And you have to put into context that all of those basically committed sacrilege against Native people's lands. And today, many tribes are continuing to face extractive industries like mining. You know, a current example that a lot of people in Michigan aren't aware of, and it's currently been halted, but it's the Back 40 mine, which is a gold and zinc mine. It's on the Michigan side, but it actually affects an area on the Wisconsin side that's part of the Menominee Nation's origin story area, in addition to its environmental effects. And it's been very hard for Menominee people to convey that significance and suggests a lack of, like, you know, empathy and understanding, right? That, you know, I think for certain people in Michigan, if a similar thing was happening to them, they would be very disturbed by that, right? But when something like that is happening to Native people, the sensitivity is very different. And I wanted to also lift up that, you know, for us, I think, you know, environmental justice is an English word that comes from a particular cultural context. And so we don't necessarily need to abide by the categories that it might delineate today. And there's issues happening right now in the state that some people wouldn't associate with the environment, but for Native people, they're very environmental, they're spatial issues. One is the issue of murdered and missing Indigenous women. This is an extreme challenge, you know, facing a lack of accountability by the police, by investigators, situations where tribes don't have the type of authority they can have to carry out the law. And many communities know these stories, but they're also not lifted up publicly or in the media to the same degree as if a similar thing happened to somebody from you know, a more privileged group. And these are spatial issues, they're environmental issues, they're about safety and a connection to the land and a security in the governance powers that are responsible, like what President Gravelle said, that are responsible, exercising responsibility. And so it's important, not to have too narrow of an understanding of environmental justice, because we can understand issues like murder and missing Indigenous women as environmental justice issues. Now, right now, at the federal level, environmental justice has become one of the major concepts driving environmentalism, and especially tied to infrastructure investments. The Biden-Harris administration has emphasized that an environmental justice lens needs to be applied to how infrastructure is improved, how legacy pollution issues affecting tribes and other communities are addressed, and how investments in renewable energy are being made. But for us, this is it's critical because, for some of us, we've been working in the context of environmental justice for a long time, but for others in power, they haven't. And what I'm seeing right now, though, is, at least at this stage, an openness to the idea that environmental injustices can greatly be mitigated if the consultation policy is deeply reformed, if people recognize that tribal lands are not just confined to reservations, but that a lot of land outside of reservations was ceded unconsensually, and that for many Native people, that is very significant land, including land where they have treaty rights, but also other land that currently have other statuses, but that were part of problematic forms of dispossession, similar to the situation of the Menominee Nation that I just described earlier. And that we're seeing a sense in which tribal cultural heritage, tribal ancestral heritage in particular areas matters and means something, whether or not it's on a designated reservation. And we're also seeing the uplifting of culture, of Indigenous knowledge, as playing a role in understanding not only what environmental justice means, but what knowledge should carry the most weight when people are working together to assess risks and opportunities.
I wanted to build on something Kyle just said as well, to provide more context, not only from the treaty perspective, but on just land in general. Native peoples are very tied to their land. And a lot of that has to do, what Professor Whyte just identified was those historical problems that we've always had with our land. When you talk about land removal, when you talk about the creation of reservations, a lot of people don't know that when reservations were carved out for tribal nations, it was often the unwanted land that could not be utilized for agriculture, for farming, or for any other type of development. To give a specific example, Bay Mills Indian community is all on wetlands, so for us to build any type of infrastructure here, we have to go through a lot of different loops and regulatory and permitting processes. And then when we actually do build, the few resources we have to create infrastructure is doubled, because the foundations on wetlands are very hard to create any type of infrastructure. So when you look at that historical removal, the creation of the reservation land base, Native people are already so protective of the land that they do have and the land that they're able to access for their treaty rights or for their ceremony or for their religious beliefs, because all of that has been taken from them before. And all of that, it was part of a federal and state policy to shove Native people, to the small corners of these land bases within the state. So that they were out of sight and out of mind. So when we really look at it, environmental justice from a historical context, this is something that Native people have been dealing with for centuries. That's why we start to see, these land back movements, allowing Native people to take care of the land that they had traditionally occupied, because they have that best understanding and relationship with the land. And although they had been removed and placed on reservations and were taken away from those lands, it doesn't mean that that knowledge did not continue to exist within that community.
Yeah, I think it makes, the important point that nearly every injustice that Indigenous people on the continent have suffered has been environmental injustice. It has ruptured those relationships that, we maintained and continue to maintain with the land, and that we're continually reestablishing. So I wonder, we don't have that much time left. So I wanted to give you both an opportunity to just provide what if there was one thing that you hope people attending this panel learn, what would it be?
Yeah, I appreciate the chance to share that. For me, it's that people really have to be serious about the fact that you have to change your perspective. You really have to understand, and President Gravelle mentioned this much earlier, that for a lot of Native people, our situation is we existed as self-governing before the formation of the United States, and we inherit that significance throughout each generation. So for us, we look at the United States from that perspective, right? It's an unbroken chain. And similarly with knowledge and with connection to the environment, these aren't things that we associate with diversity or inclusivity. We associate them with a much longer trajectory of our history. And so for us, the United States is a small period of our history. Our history is much longer than that. And for a lot of my colleagues, right, they almost see things a little bit differently, right? They see, well, all the significance is in the US period, and who knows what came before. But I really just encourage people to think about their embodiment, to think about their perspective and the shift that it's going to need to take.
And I would ask that, everyone just think of including tribal nations in the conversation. The health and well-being of tribes and our citizens depends on the health and well-being of those important natural resources that our tribal nation depends on. And as Professor Whyte just identified, for thousands of years, Native people were engaged in the management of our resources. We ensured the strength of our people in shaping their distinctive cultural practices and identities in that process and in that relationship with the natural environment. We have a unique, I think, perspective and expertise on how we should interact with natural environments. And because many of those resources are not under tribal jurisdiction or under tribal management, it is in the best interest of not only tribes, but also in the best interest of state governments as well as federal governments to include tribes in those conversations, so that we can collectively ensure the respect of those resources, collectively ensure the responsibility for those resources, and to some degree allow those historical and present day environmental justices that tribal nations continue to suffer from to be healed and corrected and move forward on a good path where we're working collaboratively and collectively together and not against one another. So including tribal nations, whether you come from a state or federal agency or a private company, I think is one of the very first steps we can all take to ensuring that these types of environmental justice issues do not continue in the future as well.
Great. Yeah, and then one thing I've heard time and again from people like Frank Edward-Gishik and Marvin Defoe and Josephine Mandam and some of our elders in our Anishinaabe culture has been the importance of listening, and the importance of not only listening to other people and your community, but also listening to the environment, going out and being at the lake and listening and contemplating what that lake provides for you, what the trees provide for you, what the air provides, and what you can provide it also, and what it needs, because it is alive. The soil is alive, the water is alive, our air is alive, and we are alive. And it's our responsibility to take care of each other and take care of our environment. So we only have 1 minute, and there were a few questions. I don't know that we'll be able to get to them. I don't want to hold the panels up at all. I guess in closing, I just want to say Chimigwech, thank you so much to Professor Whyte, and Chimigwech to President Whitney Gravelle, the Bay Mills Indian community at University of Michigan. I think you can find our contact information if you have any follow-up questions with the conference organizers. And again, my name is John Petoskey. I'm an attorney at the Environmental Law and Policy Center. You can contact me if you have any follow-up questions as well. So Chimigwech, everybody, for attending. And we hope that you learned a lot and the importance of listening, and the importance of continuing to improve relations between tribal governments and the United States and the state of Michigan.
Miigwech, everyone.
Okay, great information. So really appreciate these presentations, and want to let everybody know that the next session will start at 4 p.m. and that is going to be on water equity sessions. As a reminder, you can go back into this session in the Whova app and you can rate this session. And we appreciate you attending this session and look forward to seeing you throughout the rest of this conference. Thank you.